Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on Bitcoin and the future of finance. And to help us with that, we're going to be looking at a recent interview with legendary investor Tim Draper.
Oh yeah, Draper's one of the OGs of venture capital.
He really is. He's got an incredible track record.
Like Tesla, SpaceX, Skype, he was in on all of those early on.
He was. And in this interview on Thinking Crypto, he shared some pretty mind-blowing predictions about where things are headed.
I'm intrigued. What kind of predictions are we talking about?
Where he talks about Bitcoin surpassing $250,000.
Wow. Okay.
He predicts the potential collapse of the dollar.
That's a bold statement.
It is, and he's pretty outspoken about how the U.S. could fall behind in the global race for blockchain innovation.
All right, this is going to be interesting. So where do we start with Tim Draper?
Well, it's actually pretty fascinating how he went from traditional finance to becoming a Bitcoin evangelist.
Yeah, he's like deeply rooted in that world.
He is. His grandfather, William Henry Draper Jr., was actually the very first venture capitalist in Silicon Valley.
Oh wow, so he was practically born into it.
Pretty much. But even with that background, he's always been drawn to disruptive innovation, and that's what led him to Bitcoin.
So when did he first get into Bitcoin?
Well, it all started back in 2010.
Okay.
An associate of his introduced him to this guy named Peter Basin, who was an early Bitcoin advocate.
Okay.
And this is actually kind of funny. Draper was already familiar with the idea of digital currency.
Really?
Yeah, he'd been observing virtual economies and online games. And he even shared this anecdote about a father in Korea who bought his son a digital sword for his birthday using real dollars. And that got him thinking, could digital assets actually hold real-world value?
Interesting. So meeting Basin was kind of like a confirmation of what he was already seeing.
Exactly.
But, a lot of people were skeptical about Bitcoin back then.
Oh, absolutely. And even Draper had his doubts. But his belief really solidified after the Mt. Gox collapse.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal. A lot of people lost a lot of money.
He did too. He lost a significant amount of Bitcoin.
Wow. But he still held on.
He did. And he said what surprised him was how quickly the currency's value stabilized after that crash. And that's when he realized Bitcoin wasn't just some speculative bubble.
Oh, I see.
It had inherent resilience because people were actually using it.
For like real world stuff?
Yeah, for like cross-border payments, for hedging against inflation and unstable economy.
Right, so it had utility.
Exactly. And that brings us to Draper's core argument. Bitcoin is a superior form of currency.
Okay.
And look, we've all heard that before. But he goes beyond just the usual talking points.
Yeah, how so?
He gave this real-world example that really stuck with me. He said, during the pandemic, when all the traditional remittance services were getting disrupted,
Right.
Bitcoin became a lifeline for overseas workers who were trying to send money back home to their families.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because the decentralized nature of Bitcoin meant that they didn't have to rely on banks or governments to send money.
And it was probably faster and cheaper, too.
It was.
So it was like this perfect use case for a global, borderless financial system.
Exactly. And it really highlighted the power of Bitcoin in a crisis.
So where do things go from here? I mean, do countries start adopting Bitcoin?
Well, some already have.
Really?
Yeah, like El Salvador and Panama.
Oh, wow. I hadn't even heard about Panama.
They've adopted it as legal tender. And Draper believes that this trend is just going to accelerate.
Wow.
And he even made this pretty provocative prediction about the dollar.
I bet I can guess he thinks it's going to crash.
He does, and he even quoted this. He said, as Bitcoin's purchasing power increases and more retailers start accepting it, people are going to rush to convert their depreciating dollars into Bitcoin.
Makes sense. If you think your dollars are going to be worth less, you're going to want to get into something that you think is going to hold its value.
Exactly. And he painted this rather dramatic picture of what could happen, like people panicking, rushing to withdraw their money from banks.
Oh, yeah, classic bank run.
A bank run. And he even drew this parallel to his father had gifted him a Confederate $1 million note.
Oh, wow.
And of course, after the South lost the Civil War, that became utterly worthless.
Right.
So his point is that the dollar, like any fiat currency, is ultimately backed by trust in the government.
And that trust can be fragile.
Exactly. He's not saying the dollar is going to disappear overnight, but he does believe that its dominance is waning.
Because people are looking for alternative stores of value.
Right.
Interesting. So what does Draper recommend people do?
Well, he's a big proponent of what's called self-custody.
Oh, yeah, holding your own Bitcoin.
Exactly. Rather than relying on like third-party custodians
Right.
like exchanges.
Right.
And he even had this catchy phrase for it. He said, Bitcoin on Ledger.
Bitcoin on Ledger.
And Ledger is a hardware wallet.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. So it's a physical device that stores your Bitcoin offline, which makes it way more secure.
Got it.
And he actually prefers this to investing in Bitcoin ETFs.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, he says ETFs, yeah, they can be convenient, but they don't give you direct control over your Bitcoin.
Right.
And he sees owning the actual asset as crucial for true financial sovereignty.
Okay, I can see that.
And this actually became super relevant after the recent collapse of Silicon Valley Bank.
Oh, yeah. How does that tie in?
Well, he shared how a bunch of companies that he had invested in suddenly needed emergency funds.
Because their money was tied up in SVB?
Exactly.
Ow.
So it was a real wake-up call about how vulnerable our current financial system is.
And it really reinforces the idea of not keeping all your eggs in one basket.
Right. And after that whole debacle,
Mm-hmm.
Draper started advising companies to diversify their holdings.
Makes sense.
Keep some funds in a large bank,
Uh-huh.
some in a smaller bank, and then, of course, some in Bitcoin.
To hedge against different types of risk.
Exactly, whether it's bank failures or inflation or even government seizure of assets.
Wow. Okay.
And this all ties into his bigger vision of creating a more equitable and accessible financial system.
Where individuals have more control over their own destinies.
Right. So before we go too deep into that, I think we need to switch gears for a second and talk about what Draper had to say about the regulatory landscape, because things get really interesting there.
Okay, let's do it.
So back in 2018, Draper actually predicted a lot of the challenges that the crypto industry is facing right now.
Wow, really?
He did. He actually warned Gary Gensler, who wasn't the SEC chair at the time, about this coming crackdown on crypto.
Uh-huh.
He talked about the weaponization of regulators and the pressure from incumbents like Jamie Dimon to try to stifle innovation.
And, well, he was right.
It's almost eerie how accurately he foresaw this current climate.
Yeah.
And he's actually deeply concerned that the U.S., with its increasingly hostile regulatory environment, is pushing entrepreneurs and investment to more crypto-friendly countries.
Which, I mean, would make sense. If you're trying to innovate and you feel like the regulations are holding you back, you're going to go somewhere where you have more freedom.
Exactly. And he even contrasted this with President Clinton's approach to the early internet, which was largely hands-off.
Which is probably one of the reasons why the U.S. was able to become such a leader in tech.
Exactly. But now Draper's worried that with all this overregulation, the U.S. is going to miss out on the opportunity to lead in the blockchain revolution.
Interesting. So what are some examples of these regulations that are holding things back?
We gave a couple of concrete examples, like restrictions on airdrops.
Airdrops.
Yeah, they're basically like free distributions of tokens.
Oh, right.
And then regulations that make it really difficult for crypto betting platforms to operate. And he argues that all these restrictions are pushing innovation overseas.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a brain drain.
It is.
If the brightest minds and the most ambitious entrepreneurs are going elsewhere, that's going to hurt the U.S. in the long run.
It will. And it raises this pretty important question for us. If the U.S. continues down this path, are other countries going to seize the opportunity?
And become the new hubs for blockchain technology.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Okay, so I'm curious to hear what Draper has to say about the potential of blockchain beyond just Bitcoin. I mean, he's clearly a big believer in the technology itself.
He is, and he had some really thought-provoking insights on that in the interview. He talks about the evolution of fundraising and the role of venture capital in a decentralized world.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
It is. We'll definitely dive into that. But first, let's take a look at Draper's Bitcoin price prediction.
Okay, the big one. $250,000. So remind me again, what was his prediction?
He's saying Bitcoin's going to hit $250,000.
Okay, that's a huge jump.
It is, and even some hardcore Bitcoin supporters are raising their eyebrows at that one.
Understandably, but Draper, he seems pretty confident.
He is, and he actually attributes his previous misprediction. He predicted $250,000 by 2021. He says he missed that because of all the regulatory hurdles that came up.
Yeah.
And all the FUD.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Exactly.
Which, let's be honest, there's been a lot of that surrounding crypto.
There has, but this time around, he thinks the 250,000 mark will be reached either by Bitcoin surging upwards,
Okay.
or by the dollar plummeting,
Or both.
or both. He sees it as kind of an inevitable outcome as more people realize the limitations of fiat currency and the potential of Bitcoin as a global store of value.
Right. So this prediction actually ties back to his belief that governments will eventually be forced to embrace Bitcoin,
He thinks so?
not just as a reserve asset, but potentially as a primary currency.
He does.
I mean, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is.
Imagine, like, the U.S. government saying, okay, we're switching to Bitcoin.
I know.
It's hard to even fathom.
It is.
But, Draper's point is that the momentum is building. It's becoming harder and harder to just ignore the growing adoption of Bitcoin.
He uses El Salvador as an example where it's legal tender now.
Right.
And he believes that more and more countries are going to follow suit.
Interesting.
So it's definitely a thought experiment to kind of wrap your head around. What would that look like?
Right. Like, what would a world where Bitcoin is the dominant currency?
Yeah.
What would that mean for global trade? What would that mean for the role of central banks?
Even for the concept of nation states.
It's crazy to think about.
It is. And it kind of forces us to confront some maybe uncomfortable truths about the fragility of our current financial system.
And to at least consider the possibility of a future that looks radically different from what we're used to.
Now, before we get too carried away with like the hypothetical future of Bitcoin,
Yeah.
let's bring it back down to earth for a second.
Okay.
Because remember, Draper shared a really personal story about how he actually advised the companies he invests in
Uh-huh.
to diversify their treasury holdings after seeing what happened with Silicon Valley Bank.
Right.
And he recommended keeping some funds in a large bank, some in a smaller bank,
Okay.
and some in Bitcoin.
So again, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. It's a pragmatic approach to mitigating risk in a world where traditional institutions, frankly, are looking more and more vulnerable.
For sure.
And this ties back to one of his key messages, self-custody.
Having control of your assets.
Right. He believes that individuals and businesses should have direct control over their assets and that relying on third parties,
Like banks and exchanges.
yeah, comes with inherent risks.
Which, I mean, we saw that play out with SVB.
We did. So it really is about taking ownership of your financial future, not being at the mercy of institutions that may or may not have your best interests at heart.
And this message resonates even if you're not fully on board with Bitcoin.
It does.
Like the idea, diversification and self-custody. Those are principles that apply regardless of what asset class you're talking about.
They do. And even if you're skeptical of crypto, there are some valuable lessons there.
Okay, so we've talked about Bitcoin as a currency. We've talked about the regulatory landscape, but let's zoom out a little bit. What does Draper have to say about the broader impact of blockchain technology itself?
Well, he sees it as a transformative force
Okay.
in areas like real estate.
Real estate.
He brought up this company called Propi that's using blockchain to revolutionize property ownership and title transfers. It's actually pretty fascinating.
So using the blockchain to create like a digital record of property ownership.
Exactly, which could really streamline the whole process.
Make it more secure.
Make it more secure. And he's interested in NFTs too,
Okay.
but not in the way you might think.
Not the like Bored Apes and all that.
Not the like speculative stuff.
Yeah.
He's interested in the potential of NFTs for representing ownership of real-world assets,
Ah, I see.
like physical artwork,
Okay.
real estate.
So using NFTs as a way to tokenize real-world assets.
Exactly.
Interesting. So he's really looking beyond the hype.
He stresses that any token offering in his portfolio has to have a clear purpose and real-world utility.
Beyond just speculation.
Beyond just speculation. This focus on utility, on tangible value. That's key to understanding his investment philosophy. He's not chasing hype or quick profits.
Right.
He's looking for projects that are building the infrastructure for a decentralized future.
Whether it's through like innovative wallet solutions,
Yeah.
platforms that enable seamless peer-to-peer transactions.
Exactly. And he even highlights projects like Arkham. They're working to bring transparency to the blockchain by linking Bitcoin wallets to real-world identities.
Okay, so that kind of goes against the whole anonymity thing.
It does, and I know that raises privacy concerns for some people,
Yeah.
but Draper sees it as a necessary step towards wider adoption.
To bring Bitcoin into the mainstream.
Exactly, to legitimize the use of Bitcoin in everyday transactions.
I mean, I guess if you want Bitcoin to be used for everyday things like buying groceries or paying rent, you need some way to connect it to the real world.
You do. So he's essentially arguing that for Bitcoin to truly go mainstream, it needs to kind of move beyond the realm of anonymity and integrate more with the systems and institutions that govern our daily lives.
Interesting. So I'm curious, where does he see this all going? Like, what's his ultimate vision for this decentralized future?
Well, one of the things that he talked about that was really fascinating is this convergence of blockchain technology with artificial intelligence.
Okay, now we're getting into some really futuristic
I
stuff.
know, it's mind-blowing when you really think about it. He envisions this future where our digital identities, which would be managed through secure blockchain wallets, interact seamlessly with a world that's increasingly powered by AI.
So it's like your blockchain wallet becomes the central hub for your digital life.
Exactly. Not only does it hold your digital assets,
Uh-huh.
but it also verifies your identity,
Okay.
tracks your reputation, and grants you access to personalized services and experiences that are tailored to your needs and preferences.
Okay, so it's like a combination of a digital passport, a credit score, and a personal assistant all rolled into one.
Exactly. And it's both exciting and a little bit unsettling, right?
Yeah, it makes you think about those boundaries between the real and virtual worlds and how those boundaries might start to become more blurred.
They will.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Draper's emphasis on human adaptation really comes in.
Okay.
Because he believes we have this innate ability to evolve alongside technology,
Mm-hmm.
finding new ways to harness its power while also mitigating the potential downsides.
And he's not just talking about like learning how to use new gadgets,
Right.
right? It's about adapting our mindsets.
Exactly. Our behaviors, our skills, even our values to this rapidly changing technological landscape.
It's like a fundamental shift in how we think about ourselves and our place in the world.
It is, and he drew parallels to past technological revolutions,
Okay.
pointing out that, we've always found ways to adapt and thrive in the face of disruptive change.
So he's optimistic about our ability to navigate this new era of blockchain and AI.
He is. He thinks we could do it, but he's not naive to the potential risks and challenges.
Right, because there are definitely some valid concerns.
There are, like privacy,
Job displacement.
the potential for these technologies to be used for malicious purposes.
So what's his take on those concerns?
Well, he stresses the need for open dialogue and collaboration between technologists and policymakers and the public.
To ensure that these tools are used for good.
For good.
I mean, it's kind of like with any powerful technology, right?
Right.
It can be used for good or for bad.
It can, and it really depends on the choices we make as a society.
It really is about finding that balance, harnessing the power of technology while also safeguarding our values and our humanity.
It is, and speaking of balancing things,
Yeah.
one of the most thought-provoking parts of the interview was when Draper talked about the metaverse.
The metaverse, okay.
And it's clear he's not just thinking about, VR headsets and gaming.
Right.
He seems to envision something much bigger, like this integrated digital layer woven into our everyday experiences.
Okay, so like the metaverse as an extension of the physical world.
Exactly.
Interesting. And how does he see that playing out?
Well, it's actually pretty interesting. He connects this vision of the metaverse to his belief in the transformative power of AI.
Okay.
He even, joked about wanting a robot assistant to fetch his wallet from a restaurant if he forgets it.
Right, like a real-world application of AI within this metaverse concept.
Exactly.
Interesting.
It's a simple example, but it illustrates how he sees AI becoming this seamless part of our daily routines.
Yeah, like anticipating our needs, simplifying our lives.
Exactly. And he even talked about AI, like managing our calendars, handling our finances, personalizing our interactions with the digital world.
So it's not just about convenience.
It's
about AI actually enhancing our capabilities.
It is.
Making us more efficient, more connected, more in control.
Exactly. And he sees the metaverse as this platform for creating entirely new forms of entertainment and education and social interaction.
So like you could attend a virtual concert with friends who are across the world.
You could.
Explore historical sites through immersive simulations.
You could.
Collaborate on projects in virtual workspaces that actually feel like you're there in person.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a pretty compelling vision.
It is. It's a future where those lines between the physical and digital worlds become increasingly blurred.
Which is, exciting, but also a little bit scary.
It is.
Like, what does it mean for our sense of self?
What does it mean for privacy?
What happens when these virtual experiences start to feel more real than our actual lives?
Yeah, and Draper acknowledges these concerns.
Okay.
He talked about, the potential for these advancements to raise questions about privacy and security.
Right.
and the potential for tech companies to exert even more control over our lives.
But he's not just blindly embracing these technologies.
He's not.
He's recognizing the potential downsides.
He is. And that's where he brings it back to human agency and adaptability.
Right. We have a choice.
We do. We can either passively accept the technologies that are presented to us,
Or we can actively engage in shaping them.
to align with our values.
Our aspirations for the future.
He reminded us that throughout history, humans have always adapted to new technologies.
Right.
We find ways to harness their power while also mitigating the potential downsides.
And he believes this time will be no different.
He does. He thinks we have the capacity to shape the metaverse and the role of AI in our lives.
It's empowering
It is.
to think that we're not just passive bystanders in this technological revolution.
We're not. We actually have the ability to influence its direction.
So what does that mean for us? Like, what do we need to do to prepare for this future?
Well, he challenged us to think about the skills and mindsets that are going to be essential in this rapidly evolving landscape.
Okay, like what?
Things like creativity,
Okay.
critical thinking,
Adaptability?
the ability to learn and unlearn things quickly.
Exactly, because the pace of change is only going to accelerate from here.
Right. So we need to be lifelong learners, constantly adapting to new information and new technologies.
And this brings us to what might be the most important takeaway from our deep dive into Tim Draper's world.
Okay, what's that?
The future isn't something that just happens to us, it's something we actively create.
Powerful.
It is.
And a little bit daunting.
It is, but Draper's story really reminds us that innovation comes from embracing those unconventional ideas.
From being willing to challenge the status quo.
Right, he doesn't claim to have all the answers,
Uh-huh.
but he encourages us to stay curious, to keep learning.
And to actively participate in building the future we want to see.
Exactly. So whether you're a seasoned crypto enthusiast or just starting to explore the world of Bitcoin and blockchain, Draper's insights offer this really fascinating glimpse into a future that's full of promise.
And potential peril. But he doesn't shy away from those bold predictions. And he really emphasizes the importance of human agency in shaping the trajectory of these technologies.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this. If Tim Draper is right and the world is moving towards a decentralized, Bitcoin-based financial system, what implications does this have for your life, your investments, and the future you envision?
It's a question worth pondering. I hope it sparks your curiosity and continued exploration. Thanks for joining us.